When a man stays in a relationship longer than he should, it's rarely because he's weak. It's because he cares, he hopes, and he tries harder than he ever admits. But there comes a moment where holding on doesn't make you loyal, it makes you lost. In this video, we're going to talk about how to recognize that moment when staying becomes self-betrayal and walking away becomes your breakthrough. There comes a point in a relationship where you stop asking, why isn't she giving more? And you start asking, why am I losing myself? Emotional peace is not just a romantic luxury, it is the emotional oxygen of a relationship. When you find yourself constantly sacrificing your calm just to maintain connection, you aren't in love. You're in survival mode. A relationship that once felt like a safe space begins to feel like walking on emotional eggshells. You monitor your tone, you filter your thoughts, you hesitate before sharing your feelings, not because you don't care, but because you've learned her reactions are unpredictable. That's not intimacy. That's self-protection disguised as love, and it slowly chips away at a man's sense of self. Over time, the emotional cost becomes visible in your daily life. You wake up feeling heavy instead of excited. You go to sleep mentally exhausted instead of content. Your energy becomes drained not by life's challenges, but by emotional instability at home. When your partner becomes the primary source of your stress instead of your support system, your nervous system begins to adapt to chaos. You become used to tension, used to defending your intentions, used to explaining yourself when no harm was meant. This is when a relationship stops adding to you and starts subtracting from your peace, your clarity, and your emotional stability. And when a man loses his peace, he loses his ability to think clearly, lead confidently, and show up fully in his life. The saddest part is that most men don't notice the shift at first. They confuse emotional exhaustion with loyalty. They tell themselves, every relationship has problems, not realizing that constant emotional disturbance isn't a problem, it's a pattern. Healthy relationships have disagreements, yes, but they don't leave you feeling emotionally unsafe, chronically anxious, or mentally drained. When you spend more time recovering from emotional tension than enjoying emotional connection, your body and mind start sending signals. Some men experience withdrawal. Some lose focus. Some stop laughing. Some feel like they're constantly one misunderstanding away from conflict. These are not small signs. These are warnings that your emotional foundation is cracking. What often makes this stage dangerous is the hope factor. A man stays not because he's blind, but because he remembers the good moments and believes they can return. He thinks if he loves harder, stays patient, communicates better, things will fall back into place. But emotional peace can't be forced, bought, or negotiated. It must be mutual. It requires emotional maturity from both sides. If your peace is consistently disrupted and conversations about emotional well-being turn into defensiveness or blame, you're not in a partnership. You're in an emotional negotiation where your well-being is always up for debate. You can apologize, explain, be patient, give reassurance, compromise. But if your peace still feels fragile, it's not because you're failing. It's because the emotional environment is unsafe for you to thrive in. And slowly, a man starts losing pieces of himself. His spark, his joy, his motivation, his inner stability. He becomes distant from his goals, less present in his friendships, less confident in his decisions. Emotional exhaustion is silent but powerful. It doesn't break you in one moment. It wears you down through 1,000 small moments where you choose to tolerate emotional discomfort instead of honoring your need for peace. Eventually, you begin to realize that love isn't the feeling that keeps you there. Fear is. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of feeling like you failed, fear of losing someone you once believed was meant for you. But there is a deeper fear underneath all of that. The fear that if you keep staying, you may lose yourself permanently. There comes a moment in every one-sided relationship where you stop feeling tired from arguments and start feeling tired from trying. It's a different kind of exhaustion, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. It's the weight of carrying something that was supposed to be shared. Relationships are not built by one heart doing the emotional labor for two. They thrive when both people show up, repair, communicate, invest, and protect the connection. When it's only you putting in the emotional work, you eventually stop feeling like a partner and start feeling like a caretaker for a relationship that's slipping through your fingers. You notice the imbalance not because you look for it, but because you feel it. You initiate the difficult conversations. You ask how to make things better. You apologize first, often even when you weren't wrong, just to keep peace. You suggest solutions, plan time together, try to reconnect, try to understand, try to show love in all the ways she once asked for. Meanwhile, her effort becomes inconsistent, minimal, or conditional. You feel like you're auditioning for your own place in her life while she simply receives your effort without matching it. This isn't partnership. It's emotional overextension disguised as loyalty. It's not that you mind giving effort, you value love, connection, and responsibility. The problem begins when your effort becomes the engine of the relationship instead of the complement to hers. When you're always the one fixing, always the one adjusting, always the one bending so the relationship doesn't break. That level of effort isn't proof of love anymore. It becomes proof of imbalance. It becomes proof that your emotional investments aren't being reciprocated. And even the strongest man eventually grows tired when he realizes he's the only one fighting for something two people promised to build together. You start feeling subtle shifts within yourself. You notice you hesitate before addressing issues because you already know you'll be met with defensiveness, excuses, or emotional withdrawal. You stop sharing parts of your inner world because it feels like they go unnoticed. You begin to talk less, expect less, hope less. You used to give effort because you believed in the relationship. Now you give effort because you're afraid that if you stop, everything will fall apart. That's not love. That's fear of collapse. That's you becoming the emotional backbone for someone who has stopped holding up their side. What makes one-sided effort painful is the emotional loneliness that comes with it. Being physically present with someone who isn't emotionally invested feels colder than being alone. You're in a relationship, but you feel like you're doing life by yourself. When effort turns into convincing, explaining, proving, or begging for participation, you don't feel chosen. You feel tolerated. And the moment a man begins to feel tolerated instead of valued, the relationship shifts from nurturing to damaging. Sometimes the effort imbalance isn't loud. It's quiet neglect. She stops nurturing the bond, stops checking in emotionally, stops showing appreciation, stops trying to reconnect after conflict. And you start to realize you're the emotional anchor while she drifts, knowing you'll always be there holding the rope. But here's the truth most men avoid admitting. When someone knows you'll stay no matter what, they stop meeting you where you are. They stop showing urgency. They stop choosing you intentionally. You can love deeply and still acknowledge imbalance. You can try wholeheartedly and still recognize when trying has turned into carrying. Effort isn't just about doing things, it's about showing up emotionally. And when you're the only one showing up, you eventually reach a point where silence feels easier than trying, and distance feels safer than closeness, because effort without reciprocation doesn't just drain love. It drains disrespect, rarely begins loudly. It starts quietly, in small dismissals, subtle eye rolls, sarcastic comments, or the way your opinions get brushed aside. You don't catch it the first time because love makes you patient. You brush it off, thinking she's stressed, emotional, or just having an off day. But disrespect, once tolerated, becomes a pattern. And once it becomes a pattern, it starts rewriting the way you see yourself. It's not the insult that hurts the most, it's the slow erosion of your dignity. Boundaries are not walls, they are guides for healthy connection. They are the lines that protect emotional safety and personal identity. When you communicate a boundary, you are not demanding control, you are expressing value. But when she consistently ignores, mocks, or challenges those boundaries, it sends a very clear message. Her comfort matters more than your emotional integrity. When someone respects you, they don't need to agree with every boundary, but they honor that it matters to you. Disrespect begins when your feelings become negotiable and her needs become absolute. A relationship can survive disagreement. What it cannot survive is one person believing their perspective is the only one that matters. When she refuses to acknowledge her mistakes, deflects responsibility, or shifts blame onto you every time conflict arises, what you're experiencing is not strength. It is emotional immaturity disguised as pride. Accountability is the backbone of a healthy relationship. Without it, every disagreement turns into a cycle. She hurts, denies, flips the script, and somehow you end up apologizing even when all you did was express a need. That cycle is not miscommunication. It is manipulation through avoidance of responsibility. Slowly, you begin to feel small in places where you once felt confident. You censor yourself to avoid arguments. You shrink your opinions so they're easier to digest. You alter your behavior just to prevent conflict. You don't feel heard, you feel monitored. You don't feel understood, you feel managed. You don't feel respected. You feel tolerated when you're agreeable and attacked when you're honest. And that's the point where a relationship stops being a partnership and becomes emotional containment. When you betray your own values just to maintain peace, you're not protecting the relationship. You're sacrificing your identity. One of the most painful experiences for a man is being in love with someone who respects his effort but not his essence. She'll acknowledge what you do, but overlook who you are. She may love your emotional support, your presence, your loyalty, but show little regard for your principles, your emotional limits, or the parts of you that define your sense of self. And slowly, love becomes conditional. You are appreciated when you comply, criticized when you assert yourself. You become valuable when you please, disposable when you confront. A healthy woman doesn't fear accountability. She sees it as a pathway to growth. A respectful partner doesn't see your boundaries as a challenge. She sees them as an opportunity to build trust. When a woman refuses accountability, it's not your job to fix her, convince her, or educate her. It's her responsibility to evolve. And you cannot build a stable emotional life on someone's refusal to look in the mirror. Love should never require you to lose yourself, silence your identity, or surrender your values. When your dignity becomes the price of the relationship, the cost is already too high. There comes a stage in some relationships where nothing dramatic happens. No betrayal, no big argument, no explosive ending. Yet something feels undeniably different. The energy shifts quietly. What once felt comfortable now feels constrained. What once flowed naturally now feels like effort. You look at the person you're with and you realize you are not the same person you were when you first fell in love. Growth didn't break the relationship. The lack of shared growth did. You evolved. She stayed where she was, or vice versa. And now you're trying to fit two different versions of yourselves into a story that only worked for who you used to be. Outgrowing someone doesn't always mean they're a bad partner. Sometimes you simply become more aware of what you need from love, from life, from your purpose. You start valuing things that didn't matter before: emotional maturity, communication, inner peace, aligned values, shared vision. Meanwhile, the relationship remains rooted in old patterns, old expectations, old emotional habits. At first, you feel guilty for wanting more. You assume you're impatient, unrealistic, or asking for too much. But deep down, you know you're not demanding perfection. You're craving alignment. And alignment isn't about having everything in common. It's about growing in the same direction, even if at different speeds. When a connection stops evolving, effort becomes maintenance instead of nourishment. Conversations feel repetitive, affection feels routine, and connection feels like something you have to protect rather than something that naturally protects you. You start experiencing moments of emotional distance, not because you don't care, but because you no longer feel understood in ways you once did. You talk, but you don't feel heard. You try to share your dreams, but they don't resonate. You express worries or ideas that once would have sparked deep conversation, but now they fall flat or turn into disconnect. And slowly, being together starts to feel lonelier than being alone. What many people never admit is that outgrowing someone can hurt more than being hurt by someone, because there's no clear villain, just a silent realization that your paths are no longer parallel. You keep trying to recreate old chemistry instead of embracing new emotional needs. You hold on to history, hoping it can restore connection, forgetting that time spent together isn't proof of future compatibility. Familiarity can feel like love, but it isn't always alignment. And sometimes the hardest attachment to break is the version of someone you believed they could become, not the version they chose to stay as. You notice subtle internal shifts. You stop sharing parts of your growth because you don't want to feel misunderstood. You start exploring new interests, new goals, new thinking, not because you want to leave, but because life is moving you forward. And every time you step into something that expands you, the relationship feels threatened by change instead of strengthened by it. You don't feel encouraged, you feel restrained, you don't feel supported, you feel held back. Love isn't supposed to limit you. A relationship should never stunt your evolution, it should embrace it. Sometimes outgrowing a relationship looks like emotional distance. Sometimes it looks like reduced enthusiasm. Sometimes it's simply a quiet knowing that the chapter is over, even if the story was once beautiful. But the truth that many avoid is this: staying in a relationship you've outgrown doesn't preserve love, it suffocates it. And when connection starts feeling forced, it's not a sign that you failed. It's a sign that life is pulling you towards something that aligns with who you are becoming, not who you once were. There comes a point in a relationship where love is not the question anymore and direction is. You can care deeply for someone and still realize your lives are moving on opposite paths. It doesn't always happen through conflict. Sometimes it happens through clarity. You start thinking about the future, not just emotionally, but practically. Your goals, your ambitions, your values, your desires for stability, family, growth, lifestyle, purpose. And slowly you notice that the vision you hold and the one she holds don't meet in the same place. Instead of dreaming together, you begin negotiating reality. Instead of planning side by side, you find yourself defending your aspirations, explaining your priorities, or shrinking them to maintain peace. In the beginning, misalignment feels small, a misunderstanding, a temporary gap, something you assume time will fix. You tell yourself compromise is part of love, and it is. But compromise is only healthy when it flows in both directions, not when it becomes a one-sided surrender disguised as sacrifice. When every adjustment comes from you, when every compromise costs you something essential, when your dreams consistently take the back seat seat so hers can lead, you don't feel like a partner. You feel like a person being shaped to fit someone else's life plan. A relationship should challenge you in healthy ways, not pressure you to abandon who you are becoming. You shouldn't feel guilty for wanting growth. You shouldn't feel selfish for having ambition. You shouldn't feel like you're choosing between love and purpose. In a healthy union, the right person doesn't compete with your future. They complement it. They don't undermine your goals. They fuel them. They don't ask you to dim your light. They want to grow with you, not resent you for evolving. But when your goals don't align, conversations about the future become emotional landmines. You start hesitating before sharing your dreams, because each time you do, it turns into tension, insecurity, or emotional distance. You begin sensing that your growth makes her uncomfortable instead of inspired. Maybe she wants comfort while you want expansion. Maybe she wants fast commitment while you want financial or emotional stability first. Maybe she wants to maintain who you were while you are trying to become someone stronger, wiser, more aligned with your purpose. None of that makes either person wrong, but it does make the dynamic unsustainable if neither can evolve in sync. You notice you're always the one bending, adjusting your expectations, softening your goals, reassuring constantly, compromising your direction just to avoid conflict or disappointment. What starts as love turns into quiet resentment. You feel pressured to choose her vision over your own, not because she demands it outright, but because the emotional consequences of choosing yourself begin to feel heavier than the weight of self-sacrifice. And when a man fears losing peace more than he fears losing himself, he starts abandoning pieces of his future one decision at a time. Sometimes misalignment doesn't feel dramatic, it feels dull. You stop imagining a future together, not because you don't care, but because your instincts know the path doesn't fit. You talk about goals but feel a gap. You picture your future, and she doesn't quite fit into that landscape in a way that feels natural. You don't see her as an enemy. You see her as someone who was perfect for who you were, not who you're trying to become. And that quiet awareness hurts in a different way because it's not about who's wrong. It's about who's evolving in a direction that no longer mirrors the other. In the end, it's not love that fades, it's alignment. And when alignment disappears, the relationship stops being a partnership and starts becoming a compromise you carry alone. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who makes you question your worth more than they affirm it. It doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, silently. You stop feeling relaxed in the relationship and start feeling like you're constantly proving, protecting, explaining, defending, or adjusting yourself. Anxiety replaces comfort. Hyper-awareness replaces natural presence. You don't walk into the relationship feeling appreciated. You walk in wondering if today is the day you disappoint her, fall short in her eyes, or trigger another disconnect you don't know how to fix. When love becomes a source of emotional tension instead of emotional security, you are not in a partnership. You are in a psychological battleground where your self-esteem pays the price. In a healthy connection, you feel chosen, you feel valued, seen, respected. But in a draining emotional dynamic, you start feeling replaceable, judged, or never quite enough. Appreciation becomes rare while criticism becomes familiar. You find yourself replaying conversations, analyzing her tone, trying to decode her emotions. You overthink your words, actions, timing, responses. Not because you're insecure by nature, but because the environment has conditioned you to anticipate emotional unpredictability. Your nervous system goes into vigilance, not love. And that shift is powerful because the moment a relationship makes you feel unsafe emotionally, you stop feeling like yourself. You begin suppressing your needs because asking for support feels risky. You avoid expressing frustrations because being honest often leads to conflict instead of connection. You start accepting less affection, less consistency, less reassurance, not because you don't need it, but because needing it makes you feel weak or bothersome in her presence. Appreciation shouldn't be something you earn by performing perfectly. It should be the natural exchange of two people who value each other. When you feel anxious to keep someone satisfied, you're not loved. You're monitored by their emotional expectations. One of the first signs your self-worth is being affected is when you start believing that peace only exists when you silence yourself. You shrink pieces of your personality, you dim your confidence, you avoid expressing doubts or fears because they might be used against you. You start playing small to avoid disrupting the fragile emotional balance. And slowly, the relationship becomes less about connection and more about managing emotional tension. A man can endure many things, but a man who loses his ability to feel confident and grounded loses a part of himself that relationships are supposed to protect, not destroy. It's not always obvious to others. On the outside, everything might look fine, but internally, you feel like you're constantly negotiating your worth. You don't feel empowered. You feel quietly drained. Anxiety becomes a background noise in your heart, not because you don't love her, but because you've learned the relationship demands emotional sacrifice more than it gives emotional nourishment. And when a man stays in an environment where he doesn't feel appreciated, his self-image begins to distort. He starts questioning his value, his capability, his desirability, his decisions. That is not love. That is emotional erosion. What hurts the most isn't the lack of appreciation. It's realizing you stopped appreciating yourself just to keep the relationship alive. You lower your standards for how you should be treated. You rationalize behavior you once promised yourself you'd never accept. You convince yourself that maybe this is what love requires, maybe you're asking too much, maybe feeling anxious is normal when you care deeply. But love should feel like peace, not pressure. It should feel like being chosen, not tested. And the moment staying starts costing you your inner security, your confidence, your self-trust, the relationship is no longer nurturing your heart. It's slowly training you to live without emotional oxygen. There comes a point where staying is no longer about love. It becomes about fear, habit, and emotional survival. When your peace is gone, when effort feels one-sided, when disrespect becomes familiar, when growth no longer matches, when your future feels compromised, and when anxiety replaces appreciation. The question isn't, should I leave? The real question becomes, what am I losing by staying? Not every relationship ends because two people stop caring. Many end because one person outgrows the version of themselves that tolerated emotional imbalance. Loving someone should never mean betraying yourself in the process. When holding on starts costing you your peace, your identity, your dignity, and your sense of direction, then letting go isn't abandonment, it's alignment. You don't walk away because you stopped loving her. You walk away because you finally start loving yourself enough to choose a path that protects your emotional well-being, your growth, and your future.